This is a tutorial how to cancel a real estate transaction. We're using the cancellation of contract, disposition of deposit, and cancellation of escrow form, CAR form CC, revised 622. This video is done on October 1st of 2022, and the 622 revision is still the newest version of this form. Now, the way to look at this form, it's 2 pages, but really it's actually 2 forms in one. See this dividing line here? This, on the top half of the form, this is the cancellation. And then this bottom section is basically how the deposit is refunded. So look at this form as basically being 2 in 1. And this causes a lot of confusion because usually one party initiates cancellation and that party will sign here. So let's say a buyer cancels during the inspection period. The buyer will state their reason. We'll go through this shortly and I'll show you how. Buyer signs here and then delivers this to the seller or the listing agent. And then a lot of times agents will call and say, hey, the seller's refusing to sign. And I'll say, it doesn't matter. Once the buyer signs, it's done. It's canceled. Once this is signed and delivered, it's canceled. You don't need the seller's signature. It doesn't need to be fully executed. Now, there's a small exception to that, but it's actually really simple. So we'll go through it. We'll start at the top here. By default, this form amends the purchase agreement. So we don't have to do anything else as long as we're talking about canceling a purchase agreement. We put the date of the purchase agreement, not the date we're drafting the form, rather the date on the top left corner of the purchase agreement, property address, names of the parties. We move on to the cancellation itself. Now, typically what happens is a buyer will cancel during the inspection period, or maybe even based on the loan contingency. And so in that case, which is probably the most common reason why there's a cancellation, is that the buyer will come in here, check the box buyer. They're the party that's canceling, and this is the party that's initiating the cancellation. That's who you're putting up here. And then I checked box number 1 as permitted by the good faith exercise of paragraph, and I would write paragraph 14. The reason why I would write paragraph 14 is because that's the section that gives the parties cancellation rights in the contract. If you have a special case, just refer back to the purchase agreement. But people typically write paragraph 14. Now, here are some different scenarios. So a buyer can cancel if they've asked the seller to do something, and I'll go through canceling rights for both parties. The buyer can cancel if they've asked the seller to do something like deliver a disclosure or even close escrow. And if the seller doesn't do that, then the buyer can send a notice to perform or a demand to close escrow. And if the seller still doesn't respond, then the buyer can cancel. Now, this can happen after contingencies have been removed by the buyer. The buyer can still hold the seller accountable if the seller breaches their duty or refuses to close. The buyer can cancel. And that's when, right here, it's stating that the sellers failed to do this or the sellers failed to do that. And this buyer can cancel that's the reason why, and then sign this and cancel and be done with it. Now, conversely, the seller can do the same thing. What if the buyer doesn't remove contingencies? Or what if the buyer refuses to close escrow and a demand to close escrow has been sent? Well, it has it right here. Buyers failed to remove a certain contingency, and the seller can check this box if the buyer won't remove contingencies. Now, keep in mind, if the buyer doesn't remove, you have to send a notice to perform, notice buyer to perform, and wait 2 days, and then the seller can cancel. Or if the buyer won't close escrow, the seller can send a demand to close, wait 3 days. This form requires a 3-day waiting period, and then the seller can send this and again cancel. So this basically, you're just stating on what premise each party can cancel. And it really states the rights right here. A notice to perform was sent and wasn't responded to. Demand to close was sent, wasn't responded to. And then that party can then unilaterally cancel. Now, they have this second box, propose mutual cancellation, which I would say would be used if one of these doesn't apply. But that would require a second set of signatures. It kind of creates a problem. And what CAR's done to solve the problem it creates is incorporate the second half saying, hey, if both parties signed the release of deposit, then it means they're also agreeing to the mutual cancellation. So all these up here, 1 through 5, reasons why one party can unilaterally cancel. Down here, I would assume this would be used in a case when there's no right for a single party to cancel and there's no alternative. It requires both people just giving up and walking away. Now, in the case of unilateral, only one party signs up here, not both, just one. So in my example, buyer is canceling during the inspection or loan contingency. They're checking this box. They're putting paragraph 14 right here. The buyer signs this. And it's done. Once this alone, even if they didn't do anything down here, if this alone was sent, this is a cancellation notice to the seller and it's over. That's it. As long as the buyer is within their right, it's a done deal. Now we come down here because after cancellation, it begs the question, what about the deposit in escrow? And that's why CAR basically took two forms and made it into one, because this is the immediate next question. What happens to the deposit? The deposit requires both parties, or escrow and the deposit to be dispersed requires both parties to sign a disbursement instruction to escrow. So that's why it puts different provisions in here. It explains that it's not an automatic release of funds. You can put the escrow number, escrow company here, and then here are the check boxes. Seller authorizes release of buyer's deposit to buyer. And this is what's most typically checked right here, C1. In my example of the buyer up here canceling because of the inspection period or loan contingency or whatever, this is what you check, C1. And sometimes buyer's agents get nervous, like less buyer's fees and costs. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, I mean, if the buyer incurred a cost, like they billed their inspection to escrow or something, well, then it needs to be deducted. So that's what it's saying. Did the buyer bill something to escrow? Because it still needs to get paid if they did. And then there are all these other scenarios. Buyer authorizes release of buyer's deposit to seller. And I mean, you can read through this because there's every scenario you can imagine. Buyer authorizes release of in a flat fee number of dollars. And there's no deposit in escrow. So they're all different scenarios. I mean, I don't need to go through any sort of agreement that people can come up with. But typically, if the buyer's within their contingency, they just check this box right here and it's done. The whole deposit goes back to the buyer. And then if the parties start disputing it, then maybe the buyer. So what typically happens is the buyer, if they're canceling, they'll ask for it. Or if the seller's canceling, then the seller asks for the buyer to release all their money. And then the parties might have to go back and forth on this, like partial release and reservation of rights. This is stuff that would typically be negotiated over the phone and is often disputed. Usually when someone cancels, they ask for the entire deposit back, or the seller asks for the buyer to surrender their entire deposit. But this has no bearing on the cancellation up top. This is just how the parties are sorting out the release of deposit. And this can be amended, and escrow is going to have their own instructions that they're going to create anyway. So this is almost like used for negotiation. It's kind of a launch pad. Escrow is going to draft their own amendment to have the parties release a deposit. And then this is where the parties will sign if they agree to this. Now, in my scenario, just on one final point before we wrap up the video, if the buyer is canceling due to whatever reason within the within the contingency periods, the buyer will check this box here. They'll write paragraph 14 or whatever they want. They'll sign there, and that's done. This is now an effective cancellation. Once delivered to the listing agent, the contract is done. That's it. But the buyer's also going to put the escrow number here, escrow name, C1. They're going to check this box and ask that the seller authorizes all the money, all the deposit to come back to the buyer. because that's really what should happen if the buyer cancels within the contingency period. And then the buyer's going to sign and send it. And that's it. That's how it's done. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you.